welcome to Starbound. My name is Aaron, one of the Starbound narrators. If you enjoy human-created HFY stories and you'd like to support us, we're now on Patreon. You'll get exclusive access to brand new stories that you can't hear anywhere else. All the links are in the description. Now let's get into it. The numbers had been wrong for 3 days. Henry A. Wegner had pulled the data on a slow afternoon with nothing better to do. Public access, freely available. The kind of planetary geological survey that any visiting scholar could request without raising an eyebrow. He had not expected to find anything interesting. The Vorian homeworld was old and stable, tectonically quiet by any reasonable measure. Its deep crust as settled as a world could get after 4 billion years of cooling. The survey data should have confirmed that. It didn't. The seismic pattern was wrong in a way that didn't announce itself. You had to look at it right, not at the individual readings, which were within normal variance, but at the shape of the variance itself, the rhythm of it, the particular way one type of anomaly preceded another. Henry had spent 20 years reading what the Earth remembered, and he had developed a feel for the difference between a planet breathing and a planet shifting its weight. This felt like the second thing, not dramatically, not in any way that would flag an automated alert or concern a Vorian geoscientist working within the parameters of their own recorded history. But Henry's parameters were different. Geology was his profession. He had a doctorate, 2 field postings on 3 continents, and a publication record substantial enough to earn him this cultural exchange slot at the Vorian Institute for Sapient Origins. A prestigious appointment that had turned out, in practice, to mean sitting in a small office and feeling like an exhibit. The Vorian were gracious about it. They offered him access to their databases, a generous stipend, and invitations to lectures he could attend but not contribute to. He was, in their minds, a subject of study who had been extended the courtesy of a chair. Archaeology had started as a weekend habit somewhere in his early 30s and never quite stopped. The 2 disciplines bled into each other at the edges more than either field liked to admit, and Henry had never seen the point of the boundary. Geology told you what the Earth had done. Archaeology told you what people had done in response. The conversation between those 2 things was where the interesting questions lived. The habit had taken him sideways into ancient writing systems. Phoenician, Sumerian cuneiform, Linear A, which nobody had cracked yet, but Henry found the attempt restful. Systems that didn't announce their logic, they embedded it. You didn't read them the way you read a modern language, left to right, symbol by symbol, building meaning incrementally. You found the sequence. You found the process. You looked for what the maker was trying to say, rather than what the symbols literally depicted. It was, Henry had always thought, not so different from reading a rock face. The medium changed. The discipline didn't. Earth was fine. Had been fine. Whatever this pattern was, whatever it was building toward, it wasn't home. Humanity had a talent for that. For being fine. For still being here when the math suggested otherwise. Henry held that thought somewhere in the back of his mind the way a field geologist holds a compass bearing. Not looking at it directly, just knowing which direction it pointed. He was still staring at the Vorian seismic data on day 3, cross-referencing the magnetic field readings against the seismic timeline for the 4th time, when the door to his small office opened without a knock. The Vorian in the doorway was young by Vorian standards, which was genuinely difficult to estimate. But the bearing suggested junior academic rather than established scholar. Tall like all of them, alabaster pale, with the large, dark, unblinking eyes that Henry's hindbrain had never fully made peace with. When the visitor spoke, the voice carried the characteristic soft, melodic resonance of the species. A low harmonic undertone beneath the words that the Vorian seemed entirely unaware of producing, like a bell that didn't know it was ringing. Dr. Wegner. The stress landed on the wrong syllable. It always did. Henry had stopped correcting it. I am Vale, attached to Master Rollin's research division. Master Rollin requests your presence in the Grand Archive Hall. What for? Master Rollin is engaged in the study of a significant artifact recovered from a desolate world in the Outer Survey region. He believes a human perspective may prove illuminating. A pause, measured as everything about the Vorian was measured. The artifact originates from a species at a comparable developmental stage to your own. Master Rollin feels that a perspective from someone closer to that developmental level may assist in contextualizing the Maker's final creative choices. Henry looked at Vale for a moment. Vale looked back, dark eyes steady, the melodic resonance of the voice having delivered its cargo, with no apparent awareness that any of it might land as an insult. Henry closed his datapad and set it face down on the desk. The numbers would still be wrong when he got back. Whatever they were trying to tell him, it was patient. Geological problems generally were. He followed Vale out into the corridor. The walk to the Grand Archive Hall was long enough for Vale to explain, in that same melodic and unhurried tone, that the artifact in question was a monolith of considerable age and size, recovered from a barren and geologically inert world with no current inhabitants, and no record of supporting any. That the Makers had been a civilization of some complexity before their apparent decline. That Master Rollin had been studying the monolith's surface carvings for the better part of a Vorian academic cycle, and had formed several significant conclusions regarding the mechanisms of civilizational failure under environmental pressure. That the carvings appeared to represent the Maker's final cultural documentation before their descent into what Rollin characterized as superstitious regression, a well-documented terminal pattern in collapsed species. Vale's briefing was thorough. Rollin had apparently been quite certain for quite some time. Henry listened to the certainty in the same way he listened to a colleague describe a formation he hadn't personally examined, with attention, and with the particular quality of patience that reserved a judgment without announcing it was doing so. Henry walked, and listened, and thought about the seismic data. The Grand Archive Hall was built to a scale that suggested the Vorian had strong feelings about the relationship between knowledge and ceiling height. Henry had been in it twice before, for orientation events. It had felt large then. Now, with the monolith at its center, it felt like the correct size for the first time. The thing was extraordinary. A slab of black basalt. Henry's eyes confirmed it automatically. Filed it, moved on. Old. Very old. Older than anything he had handled in the field, though he couldn't have said yet how he knew that. Standing perhaps 4 meters tall and twice that across, its surface covered edge to edge in carvings of meticulous density. Not crude, not random. The depth of each cut was consistent, controlled. The work of hands that knew what they were doing, and had taken the time to do it correctly. The surface between the carvings had been smoothed by ages of micrometeorite abrasion, the patient work of deep time on an airless world, in a way that spoke of enormous age and deliberate placement somewhere it would be exposed, somewhere it would endure. Whoever had made this had not made it for themselves. Around it stood perhaps a dozen Vorian academics in the quiet, attentive formation of people who had already formed their conclusions and were present to confirm them. Their collective harmonic murmur filled the lower half of the hall like something between music and atmosphere. At their center stood Master Rollin, older, stiller, radiating the particular certainty of a scholar who had been right about things for long enough that being right had stopped feeling like an event. He spoke without preamble, his voice carrying the hall without apparent effort. One long, pale hand moving to indicate the carvings with the unhurried confidence of a man conducting a tour of territory he knew completely. The monolith, Rollin explained, was the final testament of a failed civilization. The carvings were a complete record of collapse under environmental pressure, a pattern the Institute had documented across numerous extinct species, consistent in its arc, instructive in its predictability. The early panels show rational, if primitive, documentation of a planetary crisis. As the crisis deepened, the symbolic language had fractured. Technical representation had given way to personification. The makers had done, in their final extremity, what failing civilizations invariably did. They had dressed their fear in the clothing of gods. His hand moved to 3 panels in sequence. The Sky Serpent, the Mountain's Fury, the Grieving God. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the assembled scholars. Not unkind, not loud. The sound of people who found something gently, predictably sad, the way one might respond to a child's drawing of a thunderstorm. The attempt sincere, and the understanding entirely beyond reach. Rollin allowed it with a small, patient smile, the smile of a man arriving at a conclusion that required no further defense, before continuing. Henry stood at the edge of the group and watched it happen. He said nothing. He looked at the stone. Rollin was still talking. Henry had stopped processing the words some time ago. The words were not the interesting part. He moved toward the monolith with the unhurried lateral drift of a man trying not to signal that he was moving at all. The way you approached a rock face in the field when you didn't want to commit to a direction before you'd had a chance to look at the whole thing. You didn't walk straight at it. You came in from an angle. Let your peripheral vision do the first pass. Let the pattern find you before you went looking for it. The Vorian noticed. A few of them tracked him with those large dark eyes, mildly curious, the way you might watch an animal investigate something it didn't have the apparatus to understand. Henry was accustomed to that particular quality of attention. He didn't acknowledge it. He stopped about a meter from the stone and looked at it the way his field training had taught him. Not at what was carved, but at how. The depth of the cuts was consistent throughout. That mattered. Consistent depth across the full surface meant a single sustained effort, not a document added to over time by different hands in different urgencies. This had been planned before the first mark was made. The maker, or makers, had known what they intended to say before they said it. The placement of each element relative to the others was not decorative. There was a hierarchy to it, a top-to-bottom directionality that he could feel before he could articulate it. The same instinct that told you a geological stratum was a flood deposit before you'd sampled it. His weekends had taught him the rest. Phoenician ran right to left and didn't bother with vowels because the reader was expected to carry context. Sumerian cuneiform embedded its logic in the relationship between signs, not the signs themselves. The meaning lived in the grammar, not the vocabulary. Linear A remained illegible to everyone, including Henry, but he had spent enough time failing to read it to understand the shape of what it was doing, the particular texture of a system that encoded process rather than narrative. This was doing something similar. He could feel it, the way you felt a load-bearing wall, not by looking at it directly, but by understanding what would fall if you removed it. He started at the top left, which was, he noted, exactly where you started if you had been trained on Earth's oldest writing systems and had no other reference. Whether that was a coincidence, he could not yet say. "And you can see in this lower register," Vale was saying, somewhere behind him, pitching the commentary at the level of a docent addressing a visitor who required simplified explanations. "The symbol the makers employed to represent their deity of geological catastrophe. Master Rollin has designated it the Grieving God. You can observe the characteristic posture of supplication, the downward orientation suggesting, 'That isn't a grieving God.'" Henry said it quietly, still looking at the stone, and was mildly surprised to find that the hall went silent around the words. He turned. Every Vorian in the room was looking at him. Rollin had stopped mid-gesture. Vale's melodic voice had cut off at the exact syllable where Henry had spoken, and the expression on the junior academic's face occupied the specific territory between shock and the careful management of amusement. Henry pointed to the carving. It's a diagram of a stellar event. Or that's my best guess. That's a stellar body. Simplified, but the proportional scale is consistent with the sun. These lines radiating outward aren't arms raised in supplication. They're the distribution pattern of a major energy release. This one here looks like the leading edge. This looks like the tail. The geometry is physics, not prayer. He traced the lines without touching the stone. Whoever made this was recording something that happened, not asking a god for mercy. The silence continued for a beat longer than was comfortable. Rollin's voice arrived with the patient, faintly metallic quality of someone recalibrating from condescension to something that wasn't quite its opposite, but was moving in that direction.
"An imaginative reading," Rollin said. "For someone trained in Earth's geological tradition, I would caution against the impulse to impose familiar frameworks onto unfamiliar."
"You asked for a human perspective," Henry said. "I'm giving you one. Would you like me to continue?" A pause, the kind that had weight in it.
"By all means,"
Rollin said, and the grace of it was real, which Henry credited him for.
"Make sense of it, if you can."
Henry turned back to the stone. He started at the beginning. The actual beginning. Top register, left edge. The mark that carried the most wear because it was the first thing any reader's hand would rest on before moving inward. He had learned that from Sumerian tablets. The entry point always showed the most contact. It was the place where the reader arrived. There was a star chart. He almost missed it because the Vorian had designated it decorative, a background field of dots that their documentation had labeled an artistic border motif. Henry looked at it for 30 seconds and felt the back of his neck do something specific that it did when a geological formation turned out to be more significant than it had appeared from the ridge. He pulled his datapad from his jacket and ran the calculation with the quiet efficiency of a man doing arithmetic he expected to come out a particular way. The hall watched him. He was aware of being watched and did not find it distracting. Fieldwork had cured him of that early. The stars resolved. He ran the calculation again. Not because he doubted the first result, but because the first result was the kind of thing you checked. Same answer. The constellations on the border motif were not decorative. They were not of this system. They were Sol, Earth's sun and the stars surrounding it, as they would have appeared from a specific vantage point in this region of the galaxy, at a calculable point in time measured in millennia. The position had drifted since then, the slow stellar drift of deep time, but the drift itself was the confirmation. He knew how fast those stars moved. He knew where they had been. "Sol star chart," he said almost to himself. He lowered the datapad. Vale appeared at his shoulder.
"Dr. Wegener," the syllable stress, as always, wrong. "Master Rollin asks that you consider the possibility that your identification of the star chart is a product of familiarity bias. The human visual system has a well-documented tendency to locate known patterns within random fields. It is possible that you are seeing your own stellar neighborhood because you have been trained to see it."
"It's possible," Henry agreed without looking away from the stone. "Run the calculation yourself. The stellar drift rates are in your own astrophysical catalog. The positions resolve to Sol at a determinable historical date. That's not a visual impression. That's arithmetic." Vale withdrew. Henry moved to the next register. The next register down from the star chart was the one the Vorian had designated cartographic, a planetary surface map they had attributed to the Maker's homeworld. Henry looked at it, and the recognition arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. The same jolt the body produces when a word you've been trying to remember finally surfaces. He knew those coastlines. He knew those tectonic boundaries.
He had spent his career studying them. The ancient arrangements, the pre-Cambrian configurations that no longer existed on the surface, but persisted in the deep crust, like handwriting beneath a palimpsest. The monolith wasn't showing the planet as it currently was. It was showing the planet as it had been, as it had looked before something had changed it considerably. They didn't carve Earth's plates because they were homesick. The thought arrived in the dry internal voice he used for things that were true and needed no elaboration. They carved them to show what happened. Here is what happened to our world. Here is what will happen to yours. He let the thought settle. Then he said it. This panel isn't just a map of where they came from. His voice was level, because the information was what it was, and the appropriate response to information was accuracy. It's a record of what happened to their homeworld. They're showing you the before and after. The tectonic configuration before something happened, the resulting shifts, the new coastline boundaries. It's a damage assessment. He let that land. The hall was very still. And the homeworld is Earth. Vale's voice arrived first. The melodic resonance stripped to something carefully measured. You are saying the desolate world, the world where the monolith was found, is your Earth? No. Henry shook his head. The monolith was placed. The expedition chose that dead rock because it would last. Geologically inert, no atmosphere to weather the surface, positioned in a surveyed corridor where other vessels would eventually pass. This isn't a grave marker. He looked at the stone for a moment. It's a message in a bottle. Left somewhere it would survive. Somewhere it would be found. They weren't recording where they'd been buried. They were warning the next traveler. Earth was fine. The Vorian were doing something interesting. Henry could see it in the quality of the stillness. The particular recalibration of a very intelligent group of people whose model of humanity had just stopped working. Humanity had possessed a deep survey capability millennia ago. That was not consistent with their working model of human developmental history. He could see the shape of what it cost them to revise it. He didn't say anything about that. Something small and warm moved through him. He kept it off his face. He moved to the next panel. The disarray was quiet, as Vorian disarray tended to be. There was no raised voice, no open argument. The scholars conferred in low melodic murmurs at the edges of the hall, their harmonics overlapping in a way that sounded, to Henry's ear, less like music than like music with something wrong in it. The sound of an instrument tuned to a scale that no longer applied. Rollin had withdrawn 3 paces and stood with his hands clasped at the small of his back, a posture that Henry had come to recognize as the Vorian equivalent of a man staring at the ceiling. Henry moved along the monolith. The panel the Vorian had designated the Sky Serpent occupied the full width of the middle register, a long sinuous form that Rollin's team had interpreted as a mythological representation of atmospheric catastrophe. A serpent devouring the sky. Civilizational surrender to forces perceived as divine. Henry looked at it for a while. The sinuous form had a specific geometry. It wasn't a freehand curve. It was a calculated one. The kind of curve that emerged when you plotted a body moving through a gravitational gradient over time. The wider loops were where the object slowed near a larger mass. The tighter ones were where it accelerated through open space. The makers had embedded their physics in the art so completely that the art looked like art until you knew to look for the math, at which point it looked like nothing else at all. He traced the orbital path with his eye, not his finger, following it from one edge of the panel to the other. "This isn't a sky serpent," he said, to the room rather than anyone in particular, in the same even tone he used when reading a core sample aloud for a field recorder. "It's an orbital path. A dense body, something with significant gravitational influence, on a recurring transit through this galactic sector. These loops are the trajectory around gravity wells. This," he indicated the narrowing at the far right edge of the panel, "is the approach vector. The makers were tracking something that comes back." He moved without waiting for a response.
The panel below it, the Mountain's Fury, showed what Rollin's team had interpreted as a god of geological violence. A vast upwelling form, split at the crown, releasing billowing masses of divine wrath made visible. Henry looked at the crown of the form and at the deliberate way the split had been rendered. Not ragged, not violent, but controlled, almost architectural. The billowing masses above it were not chaotic. They moved in specific directions that represented fluid dynamics. You could calculate the pressure differential that would produce that dispersal pattern. "This is a schematic," he said. "A deep-crust geothermal vent. Engineered, not natural. Look at the bore geometry here and here. The split crown is a controlled release valve. The makers were designing a way to bleed off planetary pressure before it accumulated to a critical point." He stepped back slightly to take in the full panel. "It's not a depiction of catastrophe. It's a preventative measure. They're showing you how to build the relief valve before you need it." He moved to the next section, and the next. The hall had gone quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Less the silence of people managing their reactions, more the silence of people whose reactions had outrun their management of them. The lowest register resolved, as Henry worked through it panel by panel, into something the others had apparently passed over. Abstract geometric forms that looked, at first glance, like nothing in particular. Structural cross-sections. Load-bearing calculations expressed in a visual notation that was not so different from engineering drawings he had looked at in the context of ancient Roman construction. Once, on a weekend, that had started as a visit to a museum and ended 6 hours later with him in a university archive asking a bewildered librarian for primary sources. The depth ratios were conservative. Whoever had designed this had not been guessing at the pressure requirements. They had calculated them, built in redundancy, allowed for error. This wasn't emergency construction. This was engineering by people who had time to think, which meant they had built it before they needed it, which meant the monolith wasn't a last resort. It was a preparation. "Underground shelters," he said. "Deep construction. They're showing the depth ratios, the structural reinforcement approach, the ventilation geometry. This is a building plan for surviving underground for an extended period." He studied the final panel of the register, the one at the far right. "And this is a materials list, locally sourced. Whatever world you're building this on, these are the substrates you're looking for." He straightened. Behind him, Rollin's voice arrived. It came low and controlled, the melodic cadence stripped of its warmth, reduced to something with a harder quality underneath it. Not quite cold, but no longer soft. The voice of a scholar who had absorbed a significant amount of unwelcome information and arrived, on reflection, at a line he intended to hold.
"You are doing what your kind always does,"
Rollin said. Henry didn't turn around.
"You are finding yourself in everything you look at. You approach this stone like one of your primitive writing systems, your Phoenicians, your Sumerians, imposing linear sequence and process onto symbols that do not belong to your tradition. You are retrofitting. You are reading a methodology onto carvings that predate your species' capacity for that methodology by a margin your own chronology cannot support."
A pause.
"You are not translating. You are transcribing your own reflection."
It was, Henry thought, the strongest argument available. It was not an unreasonable argument. Projection was a genuine methodological failure. He had seen it in the field, in colleagues who found what they expected to find because they had stopped checking whether the evidence agreed. Rollin was not wrong to raise it. In another context, Henry might have offered it himself. He reached for his datapad.
"Then explain this."
He pulled up the Vorian geological survey data, the public access file he had been unable to close for 3 days. The numbers that had been wrong in a way he hadn't been able to name yet, and threw it to the hall's display surface. The readings populated across the screen in the Vorian's own notation, their own instrument's output, their own data from their own planet measured by their own monitoring systems. Then he pulled up the Institute's photographic record of the monolith's warning register, the panel sequence the Vorian had documented as the symbolic precursor imagery to the Maker's final mythological phase. He overlaid them. The hall was silent. The seismic pattern from the Vorian survey data, the irregular rhythm that Henry had been staring at for 3 days, the thing that sat at the edge of recognition like a word he couldn't quite pronounce, mapped against the monolith's warning register with the flat, indifferent certainty of 2 things that were describing the same phenomenon in different notations. The specific sequence of tremor types, the magnetic field distortion curve, the relationship between deep crust pressure readings and the surface expression of that pressure. The Makers had documented it all, in stone, in a visual language that was not mythology and had never been mythology. It was a diagnostic. It was the most accurate diagnostic Henry had ever seen for a class of planetary event he had spent a significant portion of his career studying in Earth's own geological record. The Vorian hadn't caught it because they hadn't paid the experiential tax that humanity had. Their instruments were perfect. Their scientists were rigorous. Their recorded history simply did not reach back far enough to contain the last time this had happened, and a species that had never survived something could not recognize the signs of its approach. They were not careless. They were not incompetent. They were pattern blind. Humanity had bought the pattern recognition at a price that Henry did not like to think about too directly, the kind of price that showed up in Earth's geological record as mass extinction events, and in human mythology as floods and fires and the end of the world. They had paid it, and they had survived it. And then they had done something that struck Henry, standing in this hall, as quietly extraordinary. They had carved the receipt into a rock and left it somewhere it might be found. He let the overlay sit on the display surface and said nothing. The data said everything that needed saying. The warning carved into that stone lay across the Vorian's own readings in perfect, damning alignment, and the only sound in the Grand Archive Hall was the low, broken harmonic of scholars whose world had just changed its shape. Nobody spoke. Henry left the overlay on the display surface and turned back to the monolith. The data could sit there. It wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the truth of it. And he had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing you could do after evidence made its point was to let the silence work. Rock didn't argue. Rock didn't need to be agreed with. It simply was what it was and waited for you to catch up. He moved to the final section of the monolith. The panels Rollin had dismissed as aftermath imagery, a conclusion that had always struck Henry as evidence in search of a theory, rather than the other way around. He had not said so at the time because the time had not been right. It was right now. "Master Rollin." He said it without turning around. He heard the soft sound of the scholar's footsteps. The Vorian moved almost without noise, a quality Henry had found disconcerting for the first several weeks, and had since simply incorporated into his working model of the species. And then Rollin was beside him, standing at the correct distance for professional consultation, which among the Vorian was slightly further than among humans. Henry gestured to the final panels. "Tell me what you see." Rollin was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the metallic quality it had carried during the pushback. What was left was something older and less defended.
Aftermath imagery. The Makers depicting the destruction wrought by whatever event they feared. A scoured landscape. Reduced solar output. The star depicted here is dimmer than in the opening register. Standard terminal documentation.
"Look at the figures." Another silence. Longer. The figures were small. The Makers had not been interested in making themselves large in this telling, and they were emerging. From the ground, which meant from below the ground, which meant from structures below the ground, which meant from the shelters that the building plans 3 panels back had detailed with such thorough practical care. They were carrying things. Tools, mostly, though the notation for some objects was ambiguous, and Henry was content to leave it ambiguous. Their posture was not the posture of survivors who had barely made it. It was the posture of people with a great deal of work ahead of them who understood this and were not deterred by the understanding. Their faces were turned upward, toward the dimmer star. Not in supplication, in assessment. The faces of people who had come back up and immediately started taking stock. "They made it," Henry said. "The event happened. The thing the monolith warned about, the orbital body, the seismic cascade, all of it, it came. And they went underground. And they built it right. And they came back up." He looked at the panel for a moment. "This isn't a record of failure. This is a field guide to starting over." He stepped back. The hall had filled with a kind of silence that had texture to it. The silence of people standing very still, because movement would require deciding what to do next, and they were not yet ready for that decision. The Vorian scholars had drawn together without appearing to move, their collective harmonic reduced to something barely above the threshold of hearing. It was the sound, Henry thought, of a frequency looking for a resolution it couldn't find. Rollins stared at the final panels for a long time. Henry watched the scholar's face and saw, with some clarity, the moment when academic certainty finished its collapse and something raw took its place. It was not a comfortable thing to witness. Henry did not look away from it. A geologist learned early that the honest thing was to look at what was there, not at what you'd expect to find.
"The artifact we have been studying," Rollins said, and his voice was very quiet. "With such certainty."
He did not finish the sentence. Henry did not finish it for him. What the Vorian had studied with such certainty was not the tombstone of a forgotten people. It was a message in a bottle, and the bottle had been placed with calculation and care on a dead rock in a surveyed corridor, and it had waited the length of time it had needed to wait, and a junior Vorian academic named Vale had escorted a human geologist down a long corridor to stand in front of it because Master Rollin had wanted a developmental baseline, a control sample, a mirror to hold up against primitive minds. Henry looked at the assembled scholars, their darkened eyes, the broken music of their collective distress, and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, and was mostly just the recognition of a reckoning long overdue, now arrived. They were excellent scientists. Their instruments were the finest Henry had encountered in his career. Their institute was extraordinary, their methods rigorous, their dedication to understanding the deep past genuine and substantial. None of that had been wrong. What had been wrong was the assumption that their recorded history was long enough to contain all the relevant history. That what their instruments had never measured did not require measurement. That a species which had not survived something was equipped to recognize the signs of its approach. They had looked at the monolith and seen the death rattle of a lesser civilization. They had not looked at the thing behind the monolith. The Vorian had the instruments. Humanity had the scar tissue. Henry turned away from them and walked back to the stone. He placed his hand flat against the surface, palm down, fingers spread. The basalt was cool and faintly rough under his hand. The texture of it, particular in the way that old worked stone was always particular. Not the smoothness of natural weathering, but the specific grain left by tools used with intent. He could feel the edges of a carved line under the heel of his palm. He did not need to look to know which one. He stood there for a moment. 2. He gave it its due. Behind him, he heard Rollins' voice, quieter than he had ever heard it, the melodic cadence stripped, flat, and functional, the harmonic undertone absent, the voice of a man who had set aside the instrument of his authority and picked up a different tool entirely. The scholar was on his comms. Henry could not make out the words. He did not try. What mattered was the quality of it, the brevity, the directness, the absence of any of the unhurried academic deliberation that had characterized everything Rollin had said in Henry's hearing until this moment. He was calling someone. He was telling them something that needed to be told. He was getting to work. Good. Henry lifted his hand from the stone. He picked up his datapad from where he had set it on the floor beside the monolith's base. He turned toward the door. He didn't look back. The Vorian geological survey data was still waiting on his desk. The 3 days of readings he hadn't finished mapping. The patterns he'd identified and not yet fully characterized. The work that had been interrupted by a summons to serve as a developmental baseline for a species that had needed a mirror and gotten something rather different. He walked through the door of the Grand Archive Hall and into the corridor. And behind him, the hall was alive with Vorian voices, the broken harmonics resolving at last into something purposeful, something with direction in it. Time to get back to work.